There are no spoilers for Game of Thrones in this video, but if you want a pure viewing experience of the series, then you should probably just go watch it already. With Game of Thrones taking television and the internet by storm for the better part of 4 years now, a media analyst such as myself has been recommended and even demanded to watch the show countless times now. I watched bits and pieces of it with my brother when he marathoned the show, and I appreciated the luscious production values that HBO brought to offer, but somehow the idea of the show just didn't click with me. I deliberately spoiled myself to most of the major plot events and learned enough to not feel lost when people started yammering on about the show, but I couldn't find cause to dedicate 30 hours of my life to it without the answer to one simple question. What exactly is the appeal of Game of Thrones? When I asked my parents this question, they told me that the show is interesting because so many main characters die so early into the show, and that it was unusual for mainstream TV shows to kill characters like that. Now, in fairness, I've probably watched more shows about main characters dying than they have, but it still just doesn't sound like a really good reason to get into a show. The fact alone that a character dies is not interesting, it's who the character is and how their death affects the narrative that makes their death interesting. The question I always had is, in a show where main characters are expendable and no one is really expected to have a happy ending, how can you get attached to anything? Why get invested in a character when you know they're going to meet a horrible end at some point? Whenever people told me about their favorite characters and how they watched the show hoping that character is going to succeed, I'd always ask, you know you're setting yourself up for disappointment, right? My next question for my family and friends was, what is the central theme of Game of Thrones? What does the show have to say about humanity? What does it stand for? The answers I got were that either Game of Thrones doesn't have a central theme at all, or that the theme is that mankind are all dicks and we're all going to die horribly. Not really a message I'd get behind, but it's also not really the message of the show, and I was asking the wrong questions to the wrong people. I finally sat down and watched Game of Thrones all the way through recently, and I finally understood the show's true appeal after I heard the line, "When you play the Game of Thrones, you win or you die." The key was right there in the show's title all along. This show is, in fact, a game. It's an exciting game of life and war that George R.R. Martin is playing against himself and inviting all of us to watch. It has kings, pawns, knights, and sneaky bishops, but it's not a fair game like chess. It's a complex game with countless unseen variables, where no one strategy can prevail over chance, just like life. I used to think that death was the end of a character's intrigue in the story, but in Game of Thrones, dying is one of the most interesting things a character can do. Each piece removed from the game board that the opening video so keenly reminds us of at the start of each episode makes all of the other pieces more important and interesting in their own right. Each character has to win or to die. So who's going to win? The choices are constantly narrowing, and as more characters step in and out of the fold, the answer becomes more and more oblique. The fact that every character is likely to die by the end is far less interesting than the fact that someone has to be left standing. George R.R. Martin is careful to keep his game balanced. No character makes only good or bad decisions. No character goes too long without sin on their hands. The characters who perform the most evil deeds also tend to be the ones with the most complex and interesting histories, so that we can still relate to and root for them on some level. Perhaps the most interesting piece of context that I take into this show with me is the fact that A Song of Ice and Fire is set to be a series of 7 books. No matter where things go or how they play out, there are a set number of rounds in this game. It is not designed to go on forever, but to reach a definitive climax. The series is plotted very carefully, so that even as there are big moments happening left and right, there always seems to be a lot more coming in the future. Many of the biggest storylines only seem to be beginning, and there's a great sense that the best is still far yet to come. I will admit that prior to watching this series in full, I had underestimated it. One cannot really appreciate the intricacies and intrigue of what goes on in King's Landing without actually watching the show, and I found myself impressed by how greatly written and acted most of those scenes are. Also, regardless of their moral alignment, there is no denying that Game of Thrones boasts some truly memorable and even some downright iconic characters. Before watching it, when I would ask people about this series, the only characters I'd ever hear about are Tyrion Lannister and Daenerys Stormborn, which is fair because they're easily the most iconic characters in the show. But to talk of this series without mentioning Jaime, Cersei, or Tywin Lannister, Robert Baratheon, Varys, or Peter Littlefinger Baelish borders on insult. But what makes all of these characters so fascinating is the context that they are placed in. Who is going to kill who? What are this character's actions going to result in later? Will anything that Jon Snow does ever fucking matter? These are the questions that keep this series interesting and involving and make all of these characters relevant in the first place. I shall take no life for